So today I want to talk about identity politics. History is not limited to just black people or white people or whoever. History literally means his story. Therefore, every man has their own story. Every man has his story. History is not just one man's story, it's everyone's story. And it's only when you put all the histories together that you get a narrative or a timeline. Unfortunately, there's going to be many contradicting stories, and it's going to be very difficult to figure out who's telling the truth and who is just playing politics. If we take the Bible, for example, we'll see that there are many different people contributing to the Bible. The Bible literally means many books. So it's the book of books. It's more than one book combined into a single book. The King James Version was basically King James' version of events, meaning that he omitted a lot of different histories. He took out some books, they altered some books, they translated some books from many different languages. And so a lot of people like to bring up the Greek or the Latin, and then they would like to interpret the Bible to mean whatever they want it to mean. But at least the King James Version is a single version with a single interpretation. So you don't have many people trying to interpret the same text and then arriving with different conclusions or different interpretations. Although that's what people today love to do, is they're like, well, if we go back to the Greek or if we go back to the Latin, we might see that this word in Hebrew meant something different, or this in Latin meant something different than what maybe King James had interpreted. Therefore, this scripture doesn't mean what we think it means. Often preachers, pastors, love to try and impress upon you that they're smart. And so in order to do that, they will try to display, oh, look, I know Greek, or I know Latin, or I know many long words, and I can tell you the definition of things. And before the internet, that was actually kind of an impressive thing, because that meant that you had to read a lot of different books. You had to be able to remember them on a moment's cue, and you actually had to commit them to memory. You couldn't just Google something yesterday or 2 minutes ago or 10 minutes ago because it was convenient and then recall the fact out of your short-term memory. You actually had to have read this book at some point, which meant you had to go to the library, or maybe you went to a bookstore, or maybe you shuffled through a stack of books somewhere. You found this obscure passage somewhere, and somehow that's relevant to today. So if you can cite your source, then somehow you're a knowledgeable person, a very learned man. And for 2,000 years, that's what a lot of people relied on the clergy to do, was to be literate, to be able to read and write properly, to interpret the text and recite it back to the people. Because people were not always literate. In fact, having a general population to be literate is actually a new thing. All the way back to Jesus' time, most people weren't literate. Most people were carpenters, i.e. Jesus, or they were farmers or goldsmiths or ironsmiths or soldiers or whatever, bakers, wheelers, people who made wheels, all kinds of things. And it was very popular for someone who was literate to come into a shop and read from either the Bible or many books as people were, so that they could pass the time. It wasn't until the Gutenberg printing press in the 16th century that people were even able to have a copy of the Bible. So if you wanted to hear what the Bible had to say, you would have to go to church and listen to a great orator who was literate, who has read the Bible so many times that he could almost cite it from memory, or use very scant notes to, give a sermon on a particular subject of the week. And if you think about it, this was a great way to organize unrelated people who wouldn't normally do business with each other. So like maybe you buy bread from the baker, maybe you buy new clothes for the kids this year, but all year long you're hemming your clothes. So you're not actually talking to the tailor, i.e., the Taylors, which was actually a family, because most people's last names were related to their trade, not to some land like the O'Dales, right? O meaning female or daughter of, and Dale meaning of the water. So instead of talking to the daughter of the people from the lake, you're talking to the people who mend clothes or create clothes for whatever reason. So as this relates to church, all of a sudden the bakers and the tailors are now conversing on a weekly basis as they listen to the pastor give his sermon about whatever was relevant for that week, which has a political aspect of things, because if there's a war that breaks out, if there's a tax that's unfair, and people are now talking about, we really can't afford this tax, in American history, this is really part of the American ethos, is where people will get together under various different reasons, but the whole Boston Tea Party was in rebellion of representation without taxation. So maybe the weeks leading up to that, the pastor might pull out some key passages from, the Joseph and Mary going to pay their taxes in Bethlehem, where Jesus was born. And then they might talk about all the surrounding circumstances with the kingdom and the empire and Rome, and how that relates to modern day America and or modern day, I guess at that time it was modern day, but 17th century British with the colonies and how they were the new empire. And the question at that time was, did the British American colonists, want to remain under the British Empire, or did they want to rule themselves? And ultimately, they chose to rule themselves, hence the American Revolution. So even from the founding, the identity politics were very present or prevalent as it related to religion, to your career, to your taxes, to the empire. Like, who are you? Are you an American? Are you a British colonialist? Are you a Whig or a Tory? Are you a Native American Indian? Which is it? Are you loyal to the crown? Are you loyal to the Catholic Pope? Are you a Protestant? Are you an atheist or a Baptist of some sort? Like, what's going on here? I mean, myself, growing up Mormon, which was an American variation of Christianity, it was another one, right? Where now you have all these different religions, all citing the Bible, all citing it as it relates to modern day politics. If we consider that the Civil War was fought over politics, right, which was, brother versus brother, North versus South. Does the South have the right to use slave labor to run a plantation for profit, or does the North federal government have the authority to subvert what the state was saying? So there's this long history, American history, that talked about, slavery, religion, politics, multiculturalism. And by the way, we weren't isolated. We also had the Native American Indians. We also had, to our south, the Spanish colonies, right, by the Spanish crown, who also had religion like Catholicism and Protestantism. And to our north, we had the French, who was another contender for the empire to the British. And they too had Catholicism and Protestantism, and a lot more atheists than, say the British or the Spanish might have had at that time, probably because of their relationship to modern day Germany, who, weren't always Christians or Catholics. And if we take this all the way up to the 19th century, pre-World War I, with the women's suffrage, where feminism got its roots and was saying, hey, women want the right to vote as well. Long after the slaves already won their right to vote. I'm not saying that America was ever fair. From its founding, in order to get the southern states to be a part of the Union, they had to try and balance big states dictating to small states, the majority dictating to the minority. And this was also had to be weighed against power, like wealthy people versus poor people. The poor people always outnumber the rich people, but you can't run a government if you're constantly feuding amongst yourselves. If you're always fighting amongst yourselves, you'll always be prey to a more organized empire such as the French, the Spanish, and the British. United we stand, divided we fall. I'm trying to recall a clip from Gangs of New York where some wealthy people are playing billiards in a pool hall or some billiard room like for wealthy people. And one guy gets up and says, well, if the mob gets too crazy, we can always hire half the people to kill the other half. Which is an excellent example of united we stand and divided we fall, where, mob, king, boss, or, wealthy oligarchs know this, right? They're like, okay, well, if we divide the people based off of petty tribal lines, we can always divide them. And if that doesn't work, we can bribe them. And if that doesn't work, then, there's many ways that you can divide people based off of some arbitrary attribute. Today, we call that identity politics, where you're looking for voting blocks. But there's not necessarily you're looking for, I want the Catholics to vote for me, I want the Irish to vote for me, or I need the women or the black community or the white community or the whoever's, right? It's not really about that. Nowadays, when they say identity politics, it's more like, how do we get this group of people to fight against this group? In America, we've always had a separation of church and state because the church tends to be international, whereas the state tends to be local. And you need to balance those two concerns where, yes, you have different religions and different faiths. And yes, you could have many different kind of people in that religion, but at some point the Americans had to stand up and say what America believed, or Canada had to do the same. Mexico had to do the same. France, Spain, Britain, they've been doing this all along. So everyone is kind of going like, okay, well, we need to look out for our own interests. And if we look out for ourselves, then we don't need to turn to some global, pope or whoever for help. Like we should be able to solve our own problems ourselves. So now you have this interesting dichotomy where on one hand, you're trying to balance regional interests in different cultural norms within one territory versus like international interests that might be other governments or other religions and people from other countries living within your country. So now you have like many religions, many different nationalities, many different cultures all trying to coexist, i.e. multiculturalism. America, interestingly enough, was born out of multiculturalism. It was born out of immigrants, i.e. British colonialists, coming to America and cohabitating or with Native Americans. Maybe the Native Americans didn't like it. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they found new trade partners in the British. Maybe they didn't. And if it wasn't the British, it was also the French. And if it wasn't the French, it was also the Spanish. And so now you have every kind of European showing up to your shores. Even the Native Americans didn't get along with each other. There was many different tribes, and they never really got along. They would war with each other. They would trade with each other. They were very territorial, so they would mark their turf and, defended it fiercely. The problem is that the Europeans have been at war for centuries or millennia and now have found America and brought the fight here. Even on the West Coast, once the Spanish started setting up trade posts, they started trading with Asia. So it wasn't even just Europeans. Now you have Africans, Americans, colonialists, French, Chinese, Japanese, Taiwanese, Jamaicans, I guess started showing up at some point. And, there's so many different people that have come and gone that it's like everywhere on the planet these days are multicultural. As much as they don't want to be, that's kind of what happens, especially after World War I and II and the ongoing Cold War and things like the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and international trade. Multiculturalism is unavoidable. Which brings us to modern day identity politics, where old tricks are trying to be played over and over and over again, where they're trying to divide. They're trying to divide people by race, creed, and color. And if that doesn't work, then it resorts down to name calling, like, "Oh, you're a racist." You're like, "Well, okay, who's a racist now? Like the guy who's being called a racist, or the guy who accuses everyone of being a racist?" They're like, "Oh, well, you're bigoted. You're bigoted." You're like, again, that sounds like you're name calling again. So who's the bigot? The bigot, or the guy calling everyone a bigot? Or you're anti-feminist. So now you get the anti-isms, right? Where you're like, you're an anti-Mormon, you're an anti-Christian, you're an anti-American, you're an anti-Muslim, you're homophobic, you're which is like, and phobic is another way of saying anti. You're like, well, you're anti-gay if you're homophobic, or you're anti-Semitic, right? So you're no longer anti-Jewish people, you're now anti-Semitic. And you're like, wait, I thought Semitic meant people that were from Samaria. And so therefore you're basically saying, like, people from modern day Jerusalem / Israel / Palestine or Libya or someplace like that, or even Saudi Arabia. So are you saying anti-Semitic means all these people that are from the Middle East, or are you saying Jewish people specifically? Like, you know what I meant. I'm like, not really. It sounds like you're just name calling, and it sounds like whatever you're accusing me of is what you're guilty of. There's a name for that in psychology. It's like shifting blame, where if you were a true sociopath, what you would do is not only would you refute a lie, right? But then you'll shift the blame back to the person making the accusation and say, like, so for instance, it's very childish. It's like, oh, okay, little Jimmy over there stole 3 cookies. And then little Jimmy might say, like, I only stole 1 cookie. So he's admitting some truth. He's like, well, yeah, I'm guilty, but I'm not as guilty as you say it is. And then versus a sociopath, not only would they say, like, not only did I not steal 3 cookies, you stole 3 cookies. You're the thief. You're the liar. You're the bigot. You're the homophobe. You're the... And just lay charge after charge after charge. And then if you're an honest person, you're going to sit there and go like, wait, hey, whoa. No. And then you're going to spend all your time on defense. You're going to spend all your time trying to defend yourself, as opposed to being on the offense and going like, it's not true. In fact, you're the one stealing, you're the one lying, you're the one making false accusations, and so on and so forth. So at the heart of identity politics, what they want to do is they want to find some way to divide you from your neighbor, you from your brother, and they want to get the two of you fighting amongst yourselves by accusing everyone of being a racist, bigoted, homophobe, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, something or another. Then everyone's going to start fighting. And then when everything's said and done, everyone's weaker. Everyone's tired. Tribal lines have been created, and they're not necessarily geographic. And now that you have this weakened state, you, as the rich guy, can pick the winners and then rule everyone. And you didn't even have to fire a shot. Everyone dismantled themselves. They fought to the last man, and the last handful of guys that are left, those are the ones that you're going to bribe. The Joker said, if you're good at something, don't do it for free.